Welcome, traveller. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and descend into a world where winter was not just a season, it was a tyrant, a force that decided whether families would survive until spring or vanish into silence. Tonight, we will wander through the snow-laden villages and echoing banquet halls of the Middle Ages, tasting the frostbitten feast that sustained kings and peasants alike. Before we begin, make yourself comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, wrap yourself in a blanket, and allow your imagination to drift into the candle-lit past. If you enjoy these journeys through history, I invite you to support this work with a like and a subscription. It helps keep the stories alive. And if you will, leave a comment with your city and the time at which you watch this video. In that way, we create a web across centuries and continents, dining together in spirit. Chapter 1. When winter closed its fist. Imagine it. The year is 1315. The first snow has not yet fallen, but the skies have turned a heavy pewter grey. In the countryside of northern Europe, peasants look at their stores of barley, rye, and salted meat, and already wonder, will it be enough? In an age without central heating, without the luxury of citrus or coffee, or endless imported goods, winter was not an inconvenience. It was an adversary. For medieval people, the year was a rhythm, a cycle of feast and famine, of planting and harvest. Winter was the silence after the music, the time when fields lay dead beneath ice and the granaries were tested. The historian Barbara Harvey once noted that medieval men and women lived on the edge of scarcity. And nowhere was this truer than in December, January, and February, when daylight shrank to a meagre span and the earth itself seemed to withdraw its generosity. The season's weight was more than physical, it was psychological. Chroniclers wrote of the black months, when spirits sank as low as the temperatures. Nights stretched endlessly. Days were brief, often filled with labor in dim light. Fires were not always enough. In stone cottages, smoke curled from hearths, but left corners shrouded in bitter cold. Children huddled together under wool or straw, and families rationed every crust of bread. To grasp the medieval winter, imagine stepping into such a house. The roof is low, thatched, and already dripping with frost. The door is not insulated, only wood swollen from rain. Inside, the hearth is the heart, yet even it does not chase away the cold. Smoke lingers, biting your eyes. The straw floor crunches with frost at the edges, where drafts slip in. Meat hangs salted in the rafters, a promise of meals ahead, though far too little to guarantee survival. And outside, silence. The silence of fields locked beneath ice, of rivers slowed to glass, of animals huddling in barns. But winter was not uniform. Its grip varied across regions. In the Mediterranean, winter meant rain, storms, and cold winds sweeping down from the Alps. But olives and citrus still gave some color to the table. In northern Europe, winter was harsher. Deep freezes, snowdrifts, and the very real risk of starvation if preparations failed. For people in Scandinavia or the Scottish Highlands, life in winter meant a constant negotiation with nature's cruelty. And yet, there was a paradox. Winter was feared, but it was also anticipated. With the harvest gathered in, some found brief rest from endless fieldwork. Winter became the season of stories, of firelight gatherings, of songs, of festivals. In villages, the midwinter season carried rituals meant to push back against the darkness. Candles were lit in churches, feasts were held in manor halls, and children carved toys from wood when there was no fieldwork to do. Still, the cold shaped everything. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one entry bluntly states, "This year was a very hard winter, and the earth bore nothing." Centuries later, during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, unseasonable rains ruined harvests, livestock drowned in muddy fields, and hunger spread across northern Europe. Imagine peasants boiling nettles, mixing bread with sawdust or ground acorns, eating whatever might stretch their rations one more day. In Paris, records speak of bakers executed for hoarding or overcharging for bread. Winter was never simply a backdrop. It was an executioner's shadow. But we must not think only of despair. Winter could also be triumphant, even beautiful. Picture a castle in Burgundy, snow drifting against its high walls, the great hall blazing with torches. The lord's household gathers for a feast, the tables heavy with venison, roasted goose, almond pastries. Minstrels sing, children laugh, dogs lie beneath the trestles waiting for scraps. Outside, peasants scrape their bowls of pottage, but inside, the same season that brings hunger to the fields inspires splendor within stone walls. This contrast defined medieval winters: deprivation and indulgence, silence and music, suffering and celebration. The symbolism of winter ran deep in medieval thought. Theologians saw it as a metaphor for sin and death, the winter of the soul that only Christ could thaw. Poets wrote of frozen fields as reminders of mortality. But those same poets described feasts in winter as glimpses of paradise, a hall filled with warmth, light, and abundance. Food became a theological statement. Bread was Christ's body, wine his blood, meat a gift to be shared in his name. The season that stripped life from the land became the stage on which redemption was imagined. So when winter closed its fist, people did not simply cower. They responded. They cooked. They preserved. They celebrated. Every dish was more than nourishment. It was an act of defiance, a small victory against the cold. To sip spiced wine in a darkened hall was to declare, the cold cannot take everything. To set a boar's head on the table was to show mastery over nature. To bake bread and share it with neighbors was to keep community alive when survival hung by a thread. This is the heart of our story, the frostbitten feasts of the Middle Ages. Born from scarcity, shaped by the seasons, but remembered in flavors that linger even now. When we sip mulled wine at Christmas, or taste salted ham on New Year's Day, we are not simply eating, we are remembering. We are sharing in the same defiance that lit the dark nights of our ancestors, when winter's fist was tight, but the human spirit refused to be broken. Chapter 2. Bread, beer, and bare survival. If winter was a tyrant, then bread was its bargaining chip. In the Middle Ages, survival in the dark months was measured not by gold or silver, but by the weight of grain tucked away in granaries. The simplest of foods, bread, was both weapon and shield against hunger. Yet it was never guaranteed. For medieval people, bread was more than food. It was identity. The type of bread you ate marked your place in the social hierarchy. The nobility dined on soft, white loaves baked from wheat, while the poor chewed coarse, dark rounds made from rye, barley, or even oats. In some regions, famine forced people into famine breads, loaves padded with ground acorns, bean flour, or even tree bark. To eat such bread was to know desperation, and chronicles often speak of it with horror. Grain determined life expectancy. A good harvest meant security. A poor one spelled disaster. That is why, in medieval towns, the price of bread was regulated by law. The assize of bread and ale, issued in England as early as the 13th century, established strict rules. If grain was plentiful, loaves grew larger for the same price. If grain was scarce, loaves shrank. But bread itself was never optional. It was the core of every meal, the anchor to which all else was tied. Picture a peasant household in January. The family rises late, for the sun itself lingers beneath the horizon. Breakfast is not eggs or porridge, as one might imagine, but yesterday's bread, dipped in thin ale. The bread is hard, perhaps days old, but warmed in the coals it softens enough to chew. Later in the day, bread appears again, floating in pottage, or used as trenchers, thick slices serving as edible plates on which meat and gravy are piled. At night, bread again, dipped in broth or wine if one is lucky. A medieval proverb put it simply, bread is the king of the table, and alongside bread came beer. Not the bitter, hoppy drink we know today, but something gentler, cloudier, often weaker, small ale. In many places, even children drank it. Why? Because water was dangerous. Streams carried disease, wells could be fouled. But ale, boiled, fermented, and stored, was safer. It was also caloric, a liquid loaf of bread in itself. The average medieval labourer might consume 2 to 3 litres a day, not to grow drunk, but to stay alive. In monasteries, ale was brewed carefully, measured out by the gallon to monks and travellers alike. Brewing was not a luxury, it was infrastructure, as necessary as milling grain. And in winter, when thirst was joined by cold, ale warmed more than the body, it soothed the spirit. Chroniclers note that during harsh winters, ale supplies sometimes ran dangerously low, sparking disputes between villages and even riots in cities. To run out of ale was unthinkable. Beer and bread were siblings, both born from grain, both the foundation of survival. And yet, even these pillars were fragile. A damp summer could ruin barley, a blight could kill rye. In years of plenty, granaries swelled and beer foamed freely. In years of scarcity, bakers cut their flour with peas, beans or husks, while brewers watered their ale to stretch it further. The taste of winter could shift from hearty to bitter in a single season. One haunting image comes from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Chroniclers wrote of villagers forced to eat cats, dogs, even the flesh of the dead. But what struck them most was the bread. Thin, bitter loaves mixed with ground peas and bark, so hard they cracked teeth. To eat such bread was to taste despair itself. Bread, once a symbol of stability, became a reminder of collapse. And yet, in better times, bread and beer carried joy. Imagine a village feast after harvest, the last warm days of autumn lingering before winter's chill. Loaves are baked in communal ovens, their crust crackling, filling the air with warmth. Ale flows from wooden casks, poured into shared cups. Families eat, laugh, sing and dance, knowing that soon enough the long nights will return. These moments of abundance gave strength to endure the lean days. It is important to remember that bread was not uniform. Across Europe, the recipes varied. In France, wheat bread dominated where the soil allowed it. In Germany and Scandinavia, rye and barley were staples. In Scotland, oatcakes replaced loaves, thin and tough, carried into the fields by shepherds. Each region's bread told its own story of climate, soil, and tradition. The nobility's bread, too, was different. In castles, white bread, called manchet, was prized, its fine texture a visible symbol of wealth. Only the rich could afford flour so thoroughly sifted. For the poor, this white bread was almost mythical, spoken of but rarely tasted. The gap between manchet and black rye bread was not just culinary, it was social, a line drawn on every table. Beer, likewise, had its variations. Some households brewed weak ale for daily use, while saving stronger brews for feasts. Spices, ginger, cinnamon, even pepper, might be added in wealthier homes, transforming ale into a warming, almost medicinal drink. In the north, mead, fermented honey, appeared as well, though it was rarer, more celebratory. Together, bread and beer formed the rhythm of winter. Morning bread, morning ale. Midday bread, midday ale. Supper bread, supper ale. To a medieval person, this was not monotony. It was life. The taste of bread, the feel of ale in the mouth, were constants when everything else was uncertain. There is something haunting in this simplicity. Today, bread is often taken for granted, a side dish, a mere companion. But to a medieval family, a round of bread was as precious as the fire on the hearth. To break bread was to affirm survival for another day. And beer, with its cloudy sweetness, was not a luxury. It was protection against thirst, against illness, against despair. Bread and beer, two humble creations, yet in the medieval winter, they were everything. They were the difference between famine and feast, between endurance and collapse. They were the daily liturgy of survival, consumed with reverence, for to waste either was to flirt with death. And so, when we picture medieval winters, we must begin here, with the smell of baking loaves, the bubbling of ale in a cask, the crunch of crust in frozen air. Before the swan roasts and saffron custards, before the boar's heads and peacock pies, there was bread, always bread, and with it beer, faithful, simple, eternal. The twin pillars that held back the darkness, at least for one more day. Chapter 3, Frost on the Fields, Preserving Life in Salt and Smoke. If bread and beer were the daily lifeline of the medieval winter, then preservation was the insurance policy. Without it, the granary and larder would empty too soon, and hunger would gnaw before spring returned. The art of keeping food alive through the dead months was a craft as old as humanity, but in the Middle Ages it became a matter of life and death. Salt, smoke, and patience were the weapons with which peasants and lords alike fought the long frost. Imagine a village in November, the harvest gathered, the air already sharp with the scent of wood smoke. This was slaughtering season. Animals that could not be fed through the barren winter were killed, their flesh salted, smoked, or dried. It was a grim arithmetic. Better to preserve the meat now than to let beasts starve in snowbound barns. The village lanes filled with the smell of fresh blood, smoke from curing fires, and the chatter of neighbors working side by side. This was not merely cooking, it was survival strategy. Salt was precious, almost sacred. Entire economies were built upon it. From the great salt pans of the Venetian lagoons to the mines of Wieliczka in Poland, salt was as valuable as silver. It was called white gold, and for good reason. A slab of pork rubbed with salt might last months. Fish packed in salt barrels could feed sailors and villages long after rivers froze. Without salt, preservation was nearly impossible, and so kingdoms guarded their salt supplies fiercely. Taxes on salt, such as the infamous French gabelle, funded monarchies and sparked revolts. Every grain carried both flavor and power. Smoke, too, was a silent ally. The smokehouse was a common sight in medieval villages, small, dark and thick with the scent of oak, beech or juniper. Inside hams hung from rafters, fish glistened in the haze, and sausages coiled like serpents. The slow kiss of smoke hardened the flesh, infused it with flavor, and kept rot at bay. To step into such a chamber was to step into the future. A winter larder hanging from the beams, waiting to be carved slice by slice on dark January nights. Fish, above all, demanded preservation. The medieval calendar was crowded with fast days, over 100 days a year when meat was forbidden. On such days, fish became the staple, but fresh fish was rare inland. Salted cod, pickled herring, dried eels, these were the winter foods that linked the Baltic to the Mediterranean in webs of trade. In Norway, stockfish, unsalted but dried stiff in the icy wind, was shipped as far as Italy. In England, barrels of herring rolled through ports, destined for monasteries where monks counted fish as their daily bread. To eat salt fish in midwinter was not merely tradition, it was obedience to God. Yet preservation was never perfect. Salted meat was tough, often unbearably salty, and had to be soaked before cooking. Dried fish could be as stiff as wood, demanding long boiling to soften. Chroniclers noted the complaints that winter foods were bland, repetitive, even foul. But when hunger pressed close, no one complained too loudly. Flavor was secondary to survival. Still, ingenuity found its way into these preserved meals. A slab of salted beef might be simmered with onions and herbs, transformed into a warming stew. Pickled herring could be baked into pies with spices, creating something almost festive. Even smoked sausages, sliced thin, could flavor a pot of cabbage and turn it into a feast. Preservation might begin with necessity, but the human urge for flavor refused to be silenced. Consider the monasteries, where preservation was elevated to an art. Monks not only stored meat and fish, but also fruits. Apples were layered in straw, pears wrapped in leaves, dried figs and raisins imported from warmer lands. In winter cloisters, barrels of sauerkraut bubbled quietly, cabbage preserved by its own fermentation. This sour, pungent food was medicine as much as nourishment, rich in vitamins the body craved when fresh greens disappeared. To taste it was to taste both survival and innovation. The importance of preservation can also be measured by the fear of its failure. A spoiled barrel of meat or fish was disaster. Mold, rot, or an infestation of worms could undo months of labor. Records tell of legal disputes over tainted goods and of sailors cursing spoiled provisions on voyages. For peasants, the loss of a smoked ham might mean weeks of hunger. Preservation demanded vigilance, the right salt, the right smoke, the right patience. Beyond salt and smoke, winter kitchens leaned on vinegar, honey, and fat. Vinegar pickled vegetables, turning cucumbers, onions, and even eggs into acidic reserves for lean days. Honey glazed fruits and nuts, locking them in sweetness that resisted rot. Rendered lard-sealed jars of meat, creating an airtight layer that kept out decay. These were not luxuries. They were insurance policies, edible fortresses against starvation. One fascinating glimpse comes from medieval recipe books, where instructions for preserving foods sit alongside extravagant feast dishes. The Form of Cury, an English cookbook compiled by Richard II's cooks, describes how to salt fish, pickle vegetables, and keep meat fresh for months. Even in royal kitchens, where abundance seemed endless, the fear of scarcity lingered. Preservation was universal, a language spoken by both serfs and kings. And yet, there is a poetry in it. Think of the sight. Rows of salted fish gleaming like silver in candlelight. Hams suspended in smokehouses like pendulums of survival. Jars of pickled onions glowing amber in the firelight. These were not just foods. They were promises. Promises that the family would endure, that hunger would not triumph, that the cold could be outlasted. Every slice of smoked pork was a memory of autumn, carried into the heart of winter. Even today, echoes remain. The salted cod of Portugal's bacalhau, the smoked hams of Germany, the pickled herrings of Scandinavia. All are survivors of medieval necessity. What once was survival has become tradition, even delicacy. The taste of preservation lingers on our tables, though now we eat it by choice, not compulsion. In the medieval winter, though, there was no choice. Salt and smoke drew the line between life and death. To neglect them was to invite starvation. And so, the people of the Middle Ages salted, smoked, dried, and pickled with devotion. They turned preservation into a ritual, almost a liturgy. Each grain of salt a prayer, each curl of smoke a candle against the dark. When the fields lay silent under frost, when animals huddled in their barns, when the night seemed endless, preservation spoke. It said, "We will endure. We have salted the past, smoked the memory of autumn, and bottled hope for the days ahead. And in the stillness of winter, that was enough to keep death at bay, at least until the thaw." Chapter 4, Hunger and Hope. Peasants' Winter Table. If castles blazed with firelight and noble tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans and gilded pies, the winter reality of the peasantry was something altogether different. Here the feast was not abundance but endurance. The peasant's table in winter was a battlefield between hunger and ingenuity, where every root, grain and scrap had its role to play. Let us step into a peasant cottage in February. The thatch above is rimed with frost, the hearth smoulders weakly, and the air smells faintly of smoke and boiled onions. The table is rough-hewn, scarred by years of knives and hot pots. Upon it, sits the daily meal, a wooden bowl of pottage. This humble stew, thickened with grains, flavoured with whatever vegetables survived storage, perhaps enriched with a shred of meat if fortune smiled, was the backbone of peasant life. Morning, noon, and night, it appeared in one form or another. Pottage was infinitely adaptable, for it had to be. In summer, it might be rich with fresh peas, leeks, or herbs. In winter, it was leaner. Cabbage, turnips, onions, and dried beans bulked it out. Barley or oats thickened it, turning watery broth into something that clung to the spoon. If luck allowed, a bone simmered in it, lending the faintest taste of meat. Often, however, it was nothing more than a vegetable slurry, barely seasoned, eaten because there was no alternative. Bread, of course, remained constant. For peasants, this meant dark loaves of rye or barley, often dense and sour. Such bread could be stored for weeks, hardening until it had to be soaked in broth to be edible. Yet even this rough loaf was treasured. Children gnawed on crusts as though they were sweets. Mothers measured out slices with care, for to eat too freely in January meant hunger in March. The great enemy of the peasant winter was monotony. Meals blurred together, bread, ale, pottage, again and again. Fresh fruit and vegetables were a memory of summer. Dairy products were scarce, for cows often produced little milk in winter. Eggs, too, were fewer, as hens laid less in the dark months. The diet narrowed to essentials, and with it came deficiencies we now recognize. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, weakness from too little protein, lethargy from constant malnutrition. Medieval peasants did not know the science, but they felt the weight of winter in their bones. And yet, there was hope, even joy. On feast days, even the poorest village tried to gather something special. A chicken saved for Christmas, a rabbit snared in the hedgerows, a pie filled with onions and herbs. All became a banquet by contrast. Ale flowed more freely, and neighbours came together to share what little they had. These were moments of defiance, where community and ritual made up for scarcity. Religion added its own rhythm to the table. Fasting days meant abstaining from meat, though for peasants this was often no hardship. They had little meat to begin with. Fish, if it could be had, was consumed, though inland villages often relied on salted herring or dried stockfish bought at high cost. For many, the fast was simply another day of bread and pottage, framed by prayer. Yet even this offered a kind of hope. The act of eating less was transformed into virtue, a spiritual resistance to hunger's cruelty. Winter also forced creativity with humble ingredients. Turnips and parsnips, considered lowly foods, became staples, their earthy flavours filling pots when little else remained. Cabbage, boiled endlessly, offered at least the comfort of warmth. Onions were precious, able to flavour even the blandest broth. Dried peas and beans, soaked overnight, provided much-needed bulk. None of it was glamorous, but all of it was survival. And there were small indulgences. Honey, if one was fortunate enough to keep bees, sweetened porridges and cakes. Apples, carefully stored in straw, appeared shriveled but edible well into winter. Nuts, gathered in autumn, cracked open by the fire, became both food and entertainment. These were the bright notes in an otherwise grey season, reminders that the earth had not abandoned its children entirely. What strikes modern readers is the sheer difference in perspective. Today, hunger is rare in much of the world, and variety is taken for granted. But for the medieval peasant, every winter was a gamble. Would the grain last until spring? Would the pottage pot ever be empty? To them, food was not pleasure. It was a line between life and death. This made the act of sharing profoundly meaningful. To offer a neighbour bread or a bowl of pottage was to offer survival itself. We have glimpses of this in manorial records and chronicles. During the harsh winter of 1316, one chronicler wrote of peasants gnawing on roots like beasts of the field, Another described mothers weeping as they divided loaves thin as wafers among their starving children. And yet, even in these darkest accounts, there are stories of peasants pooling resources, combining scraps to create meals that kept entire families alive. Hunger pressed hard, but hope never vanished entirely. The emotional weight of the peasant table cannot be ignored. Every meal was a calculation. How much to eat now? How much to save for later? To misjudge was to invite starvation, and yet, to eat nothing was to lose strength for the labor that kept survival possible. This balance shaped every spoonful, every slice of bread, every sip of ale. In winter, food was mathematics, morality, and mortality combined. Still, moments of joy appeared. A wedding in winter meant a feast, no matter how modest. Bread, cheese, ale, and perhaps even a pig slaughtered in honor of the day. The whole village might gather, sharing laughter and music despite the cold outside. For a few hours, hunger was forgotten, replaced by fellowship. Children, too, found delight in small treats, roasted chestnuts, honey cakes, or a rare piece of dried fruit. These moments lit up the otherwise bleak months like candles in the dark. When we look back, it is easy to romanticize the peasant table, to imagine simplicity as virtue. But we must not forget the desperation woven into it. Every bite was precarious, every winter a test. And yet, within that struggle was resilience. The peasant's winter table was never about abundance. It was about endurance, about finding hope in the steam of a humble pottage, in the warmth of shared bread, in the laughter that rose even as stomachs ached. So when we speak of frostbitten feasts, let us not think only of nobles dining on swan and spice. Let us also remember the peasants who turned scraps into sustenance, who made a feast out of endurance itself. Their tables, though bare, carried more meaning than the richest banquets. For on those rough-hewn boards lay the true heart of the medieval winter: hunger, hope, and the unbreakable will to survive until spring. Chapter 5, Feasts in Frozen Castles, the Nobility's Winter Banquets. Step now from the smoke-stained cottages of the peasantry into the echoing halls of a medieval castle. The contrast is almost violent. Outside, fields lie barren, peasants ration their crusts, and hunger gnaws like a wolf. Inside, however, firelight blazes, minstrels sing, and long trestle tables groan beneath the weight of roasted meats and gilded pies. If winter was a tyrant to the poor, it was a stage for the rich, an opportunity to display power, wealth, and God's supposed favor in the form of food. Banquets in winter were more than meals. They were theater, politics, and ritual woven together. To sit at the high table of a noble feast was to witness a performance where each dish was carefully chosen, not only to nourish, but to astonish. Imagine stepping into such a hall in December. The stone walls hung with tapestries to keep out the cold, torches flickering, brushes freshly laid on the floor, the air thick with the mingled scents of roasting meat, spices and smoke. The centerpiece of such feasts was spectacle. Medieval cookbooks like the form of curry and Le Viandier record dishes that sound almost unbelievable to modern ears. A roasted swan, redressed in its own feathers so it appeared alive once more. A peacock, its head and tail adorned with gold leaf, its body reassembled around roasted flesh. Boars' heads, tusks polished, set upon platters with fruits in their mouths. These were not just foods, they were declarations of status. To serve such creatures was to say, I can command nature, I can bend even the rarest beast to my table. And yet, behind the glitter was labor, hours, sometimes days of preparation. Kitchens roared like furnaces beneath the great halls. Dozens of cooks, servants, and scullions worked in chaos, turning spits, grinding spices, baking bread, stirring cauldrons. The noise of knives chopping, pots boiling, fires crackling was constant. In winter, these kitchens were the heart of the castle, the warmth spilling upward into the halls. For servants, it was brutal labor. For guests, it was invisible magic. Spices imported from the east transformed winter feasts into something extraordinary. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg. Rare, expensive, and deeply symbolic. To season meat with saffron or pepper was to demonstrate wealth in every bite. A noble's winter banquet glittered with such flavors, while peasants beyond the walls made do with onions and salt. This was culinary theatre, where food was both nourishment and proof of dominion. Bread, too, took on grandeur in noble halls. While peasants gnawed coarse rye, lords and ladies ate fine manchet bread, white as snow, soft as silk. Trenchers of this bread served as plates for stews and gravies, later given to servants or the poor waiting at the gates. Even generosity carried hierarchy. Nobles dined, servants received the leftovers, beggars the remnants of those leftovers. The chain of bread mirrored the chain of society. Wine replaced ale at these feasts, though both flowed freely. Red and white wines from France and the Rhineland, spiced and mulled against the cold, were poured from silver flagons. To drink deeply was expected, for intoxication itself was part of the spectacle. Mead, too, sometimes graced the table, golden and heavy with honey, reserved for the highest celebrations. The clatter of cups, the laughter of courtiers, the singing of minstrels, all fused into a defiance of the winter raging beyond the castle walls. But the feast was not endless indulgence. It was structured, symbolic. Meals often began with grace, invoking God's blessing. Dishes arrived in courses, fish on fast days, venison or beef on feast days, roasted birds, pies, custards, sweetmeats. Between courses came entertainments, music, recitations, even theatrical performances. The feast was a microcosm of order. The lord presiding at the high table, knights and courtiers below, servants bustling, beggars outside. Every role reinforced, every bite a reminder of hierarchy. And yet, even nobles could not escape the realities of winter. Preservation still mattered. The meat they feasted on had been salted, smoked, or dried in the same manner as the peasants, only seasoned more richly. Fish, too, dominated noble tables, especially during the Advent season leading to Christmas. On Christmas Eve, nobles dined not on meat, but on elaborate fish dishes, pike in rich sauces, lamprey pies, even sturgeon if fortune allowed. The difference lay not in the methods, but in the embellishments. Where peasants endured, nobles embellished. Some feasts, however, pushed beyond even this. Consider the famous Christmas feast of King Richard II of England in 1377, when records tell us that 28 oxen and 300 sheep were consumed in a single celebration. Or the Burgundian feasts of the 15th century, where entire orchestras played while guests ate dishes coloured artificially with saffron or parsley to dazzle the eye. In these halls, winter scarcity was mocked. Where peasants scraped for roots, nobles dined as if in eternal summer. Yet, ironically, nobles were also mocked by their own excess. Chroniclers sometimes noted that too much meat and spice made meals heavy, even sickening. Physicians warned that winter feasting led to imbalances of the humours, too much heat, too much richness. Gluttony was always a moral concern, especially in the season of Advent. And so, alongside the splendour, there was always an undercurrent of anxiety. That luxury itself might endanger both body and soul. The emotional tone of these banquets was complex. On one hand, joy, laughter, warmth. On the other, a subtle awareness that outside the gates, hunger stalked. Beggars pressed against the castle doors, hoping for scraps. Priests reminded lords of their duty to charity, and indeed, nobles often distributed alms after great feasts. Yet the contrast could not be erased. The same winter that meant thin pottage for peasants meant roasted peacocks for lords. Still, these banquets were not only indulgence, they were political weapons. To feed one's retainers, vassals, and guests, was to bind them with loyalty. A hungry knight was a dangerous knight. A well-fed one was a loyal servant. To host a great feast was to display power more effectively than a sword. And in the frozen months of winter, when military campaigns paused, the banquet hall became the true battlefield of influence. The symbolism of the noble winter feast lingers even now. Our holiday tables, laden with roasts, pies, sweets, and wine, owe something to these spectacles. The abundance we associate with Christmas or New Year echoes the medieval instinct to defy the cold with food, to turn scarcity into a theatre of plenty. So, when we think of medieval winter feasts, we should imagine not only the flavours, but the spectacle. The crackle of torches, the gleam of gold leaf on roasted birds, the laughter of courtiers echoing against stone. Outside, snow lies heavy on the fields. Inside, the hall blazes with warmth and abundance. Two worlds, side by side. The peasant scraping his bowl of pottage, the lord tearing into venison. Both enduring winter, but in utterly different ways. This was the paradox of the Middle Ages. One season, two realities. And nowhere was it sharper than at the table, where hunger and hope, scarcity and spectacle met across the divide of class. Chapter 6. Spices, saffron and snow. Exotic luxuries in winter. Imagine biting into a piece of bread on a frozen January morning. For most medieval people, it would taste of rye, dense, sour, plain. But in the castles of Europe's elites, winter bread might be gilded with saffron, its golden hue blazing like sunlight against the gloom. To a peasant, such bread would seem miraculous, even sacrilegious. For nobles, it was a statement. We can turn winter into summer with a pinch of spice. Spices in the Middle Ages were more than flavour. They were symbols of wealth, bridges to far-off lands, and weapons in the eternal struggle against the bleak monotony of winter food. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, pepper. These were treasures carried across deserts and oceans, guarded by merchants, taxed by kings, and fought over by empires. In the bitter cold of January, they were more precious than jewels, because they brought warmth and vitality to the table. To understand the allure of spices, we must understand the winter landscape of medieval Europe. Without refrigeration, without greenhouses, food was repetitive. Salted fish, smoked meat, dried beans, necessary but monotonous. Spices shattered that monotony. A pinch of cinnamon transformed a plain pottage into something exotic. A sprinkle of pepper lifted a slab of salted beef into luxury. Nutmeg grated into wine turned an ordinary drink into a warming elixir. In a world of frost and famine, spices tasted like escape, but they were not merely culinary. Medieval medicine framed them as tools of balance. According to humoral theory, the body was governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, each tied to heat, cold, wetness and dryness. Winter was considered cold and moist, a season of sluggish phlegm. Spices, with their fiery qualities, were prescribed to restore equilibrium. A dash of ginger to spark warmth, a spoon of cinnamon to dry excess moisture, pepper to ignite sluggish digestion. Every spice was a miniature fire, a medicine disguised as flavour. The trade routes that brought these wonders were long and perilous. From the Moluccas, known as the Spice Islands, nutmeg and cloves travelled by sea to India, then by caravan through the Middle East, before reaching Venice or Genoa. Pepper from India flowed up the Red Sea or across the Persian Gulf, handed from one merchant to another like a sacred torch. Saffron, cultivated in Spain or imported from the Levant, was so costly that an ounce could cost a labourer's month of wages. This rarity made spices weapons of prestige. To serve heavily spiced dishes at a winter feast was not merely indulgence, it was performance. Guests would marvel. How could our host afford such bounty when snow locks the fields? Nobles staged their wealth through saffron-coloured sauces, peppered roasts, gingered sweets. Chroniclers recorded kings and dukes purchasing pounds of pepper, not because they needed it, but because its presence alone dazzled. Yet the obsession sometimes bordered on the absurd. In 14th century England, records note recipes calling for a peck of saffron, a quantity so vast it would bankrupt most estates. In Burgundy, cooks tinted sauces red, green, or gold, with spices and herbs, creating feasts that resembled a painter's palette. Some dishes were served in elaborate sugar sculptures, coloured with saffron to glow like treasure. Winter tables, grey with salted meat, were suddenly alight with hues of distant summers. Spices also carried an air of mystery. To medieval Europeans, their origins were cloaked in legend. Some believed cinnamon grew in nests guarded by giant birds, harvested only by trickery. Pepper was thought to be scorched black because it grew in forests set ablaze to drive off serpents. Such myths only heightened their allure. When a lord served cinnamon in his mulled wine, he was not just serving flavour, he was serving a fragment of myth, a taste of a world beyond comprehension. Still, this luxury did not trickle far. For peasants, spices were unattainable. At best, they might know mustard seeds, grown locally and used to flavour coarse meals. Garlic, onions and horseradish were the spices of the poor. Yet even they sensed the glamour of exotic flavours, catching glimpses when nobles distributed spiced bread or wine during festivals. The distance between garlic and saffron was the distance between survival and spectacle. The symbolic weight of saffron deserves special note. Unlike pepper or cinnamon, saffron could be cultivated in Europe, particularly in Spain, and later in England's saffron Walden. But even so, its harvest was laborious. Each thread plucked by hand from the crocus flower, thousands required for a single ounce. Its golden colour resonated deeply. It was the colour of sunlight, of divinity, of wealth. To dye rice or bread with saffron was to evoke warmth in the dead of winter, a miracle of hue as much as of taste. And yet, not all were convinced. Critics argued that heavy spicing masked spoiled meat, a sign of wastefulness rather than refinement. Some clerics warned that indulgence in spices encouraged gluttony and pride. In monasteries, rules sometimes forbade the use of certain spices, except on holy days. To sprinkle cinnamon was not merely culinary. It was a moral act, a choice loaded with judgment. Perhaps the strangest element of spice culture was snow itself. In noble courts, snow was harvested and stored in cellars to chill drinks or preserve foods. Combined with spices, it became a symbol of paradox. Cold snow and hot cinnamon, ice and fire, mingled in cups of sherbet-like concoctions. This mingling of opposites fascinated medieval minds. To sip spiced wine cooled with snow was to taste contradiction itself. Winter, then, was the perfect stage for spices. The darker the days, the more golden saffron shone. The colder the nights, the hotter pepper burned. The bleaker the meals, the more miraculous a sugared, cinnamon-laced dish appeared. Spices were light against the season's darkness, warmth against its frost. They were, in a sense, edible hope. And in their pursuit, entire empires rose. The spice trade spurred voyages, wars, and monopolies. It was not hunger for bread or meat that sent explorers across oceans, but hunger for cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. Behind every gilded winter pie lay a story of caravans, sailors, merchants, and blood spilled along trade routes. To taste saffron bread in a frozen castle was to participate, however unknowingly, in a global drama. Today, our winter tables still echo this medieval desire. Mulled wine steaming with cinnamon and cloves, gingerbread shaped into houses, saffron buns for Christmas. All carry traces of that ancient longing to conquer winter with spice. What was once treasure beyond reach now sits in our cupboards, bought for a few coins. And yet, their aura remains. Even now, to smell cinnamon in December is to feel a spark of comfort, a promise that warmth lingers even in the darkest cold. So when we picture a medieval noble tearing bread tinted gold with saffron, or sipping wine thick with nutmeg by a roaring fire, we glimpse not only indulgence, but defiance. Spices were more than luxuries. They were talismans. Against hunger, against monotony, against the long fist of winter, a pinch of spice was a prayer for light. Chapter 7. Ale, mead, and mulled wine. Drinking to forget the cold. The wind howled outside the timbered walls of a medieval hall. Snow whipped against narrow windows, and the hearth's flame cast trembling shadows across the long wooden table. In the chill of winter, food alone could not stave off the cold, nor the creeping despair of long nights. Men and women reached for another comfort: drink. Ale, mead, and mulled wine were not mere indulgences. They were survival, ritual, and escape. Ale was the backbone of daily life, its brown, foamy body warming the stomach and heart. It was thick with barley and lightly bitter, sometimes sweetened with honey, sometimes spiced. For peasants, ale was safer than water, which often carried illness. They drank it morning and evening, a constant companion in a season when frost made life laborious and meals meagre. Brewing was an art and necessity, a delicate balance of temperature, timing, and fermentation. Too hot, and the yeast perished. Too cold, and the drink remained flat and lifeless. In winter, every barrel was a battle against frost, every mug a victory. Mead, on the other hand, was rarer, a drink of ceremony and legend. Honey fermented into a golden liquid, thick as sunlight itself, sweet and intoxicating. In monasteries, mead was crafted with devotion, sometimes spiced with cloves, cinnamon, or ginger, echoing the luxurious palates of the noble tables. Among the nobility, it was served during feasts, often poured into ornate goblets, each sip carrying warmth, sweetness, and a hint of divinity. To drink mead was to taste summer during the harshest winter months, a liquid memory of fields and bees buzzing under a sun that now seemed a distant promise. Mulled wine, however, was winter personified in a cup. Red as blood, scented with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, it was heated over the hearth until steam spiraled upward, curling like the fingers of ghosts. In medieval texts, recipes advise adding sugar, ginger, and sometimes even pepper. This was no mere drink. It was an alchemical transformation. Wine, a product of the earth's fleeting warmth, combined with spices from the farthest reaches of the known world, became fire in liquid form. A sip could thaw frozen fingers, lift spirits, and bind friends together in the shadow of winter's relentless bite. These drinks were social glue. In village halls, communal feasts revolved around ale barrels, each person sharing stories, songs, and laughter. Nobles gathered in castles, glasses clinking amid candlelight, exchanging not just drink, but alliances and gossip. Winter was isolating, but drink made connection possible. Each swallow was warmth, each toast a gesture of solidarity, each steaming cup a fragile shield against frost and despair. Yet drink could also be perilous. Alcohol dulls the senses, and in a season where survival often depended on alertness, watching over frozen livestock, navigating icy roads, a misstep could be deadly. Chroniclers often note winter brawls, accidents, and illness exacerbated by overindulgence. Ale might comfort, mead might enchant, mulled wine might invigorate, but the line between sustenance and excess was thin, drawn like ice over a dark river. The preparation of these drinks was an exercise in skill and patience. Brewing ale required careful boiling of barley, steeping of hops, and vigilant monitoring as fermentation began. Mead demanded honey, water, and yeast in precise ratios, often left to age slowly, its sweetness intensifying with time. Mulled wine required attention to heat, lest the alcohol boil away, and the delicate spices lose their potency. In each case, the winter hearth became a laboratory, and the brewer, a silent magician conjuring warmth from the cold. Spices again played a crucial role. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, those rare luxuries, transformed simple wine into an exotic indulgence. Pepper sometimes crept into recipes, a fiery whisper that countered the season's chill. Even sugar, costly and imported, was added to lift bitterness and enhance aroma. Each ingredient told a story, a journey across seas, the labor of distant hands, the prestige of those who could afford it. Drinking was not just physical comfort. It was a sensory map of the world beyond snow-covered fields. In Northern Europe, particular rituals surrounded winter drinking. In Scandinavia, mead was sipped during Yule, a festival honoring the return of the sun. Toasts were made to ancestors and gods, often accompanied by songs that echoed in frosted halls. In England, ale was central to communal gatherings, shared from wooden tankards, spiced subtly with ginger or herbs to aid digestion and lift spirits. Mulled wine was more common in wine-producing regions, from Burgundy to the Rhine, a drink that blended the vineyard's bounty with winter's magic. The psychological effects were as important as the physical. The warmth of drink calmed frayed nerves, eased muscle stiffness, and encouraged storytelling. In the dim light of a hearth, tales of hunts, saints, or distant battles flowed freely. Ale and mead were catalysts for community, mulled wine a conduit for imagination. In a season of scarcity and isolation, these drinks reminded people that life could still be sweet, that heat and joy could exist even when snow blanketed the world. Yet the medieval drinker had to be clever. Winter was long, supplies scarce, and fermentation slow. Ale had to be brewed before frost set in, mead carefully stored, wine protected from freezing. Barrels were insulated with straw, cellars dug deep, wine jugs wrapped in cloth. The fight against cold was continuous, and failure meant spoiled batches and wasted luxury. Every sip thus became a triumph over winter's cruelty, a small act of mastery in an uncontrollable season. The medieval imagination also imbued these drinks with mystical qualities. Mead was sometimes thought to impart wisdom or courage, ale to provide fortitude, mulled wine to awaken passion. Legends spoke of enchanted recipes, of wines that could soothe melancholy or inspire visions. To drink was to participate in ritual, to engage with forces beyond the mundane. Even in their simplest forms, these beverages carried layers of meaning: sustenance, pleasure, social cohesion, spiritual experience. And what of the children? They too drank, though in diluted forms. Small sips of weak ale or watered-down mead provided calories and warmth. In households without modern heating, every calorie mattered, and even modest beverages offered solace. The entire family gathered around the hearth, shared in the communal act of drinking, a miniature ceremony against the frost and dark of winter nights. As we imagine medieval winter nights, the scene becomes vivid. The flicker of candlelight, the hiss of ale poured into wooden tankards, the steam rising from spiced wine, the scent of honey and cloves mingling with smoke from the fire. Children huddle in blankets, dogs curl near the hearth, adults lean close, voices low but warm with conversation. Outside, snow drifts against the walls. Inside, drink creates a bubble of comfort, laughter, and life. Modern readers may romanticize this imagery, but it was grounded in survival. Alcohol provided calories, spices aided digestion, warm liquids mitigated cold. Socially, communal drinking strengthened bonds that were crucial when frost could isolate and starve. Emotionally, it offered relief, pleasure, and a glimpse of abundance in a season that often brought scarcity. Ale, mead, and mulled wine were not mere indulgences. They were lifelines, small rebellions against winter's harsh dominion. So when you pour yourself a glass of spiced wine or sip honeyed mead during the cold months, remember the medieval drinkers who came before. Each swallow is part of an ancient ritual, a thread connecting us across centuries. It is a reminder that warmth, comfort, and joy can be conjured even from the harshest winters, that fire and frost, flavor and cold, are forever entwined. Chapter 8. Festivals of Ice, Christmas and Carnival Tables. A cold hush lay over the villages of medieval Europe, the kind of silence only winter could conjure. Frost glazed the thatched roofs, smoke spiraled from chimneys, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with the tang of frozen earth. Yet within this icy stillness, life did not pause. When the calendar turned toward the longest nights, communities prepared not only for survival, but for celebration. Christmas and Carnival, two festivals nestled in the frozen months, brought light, warmth, and abundance, if only for fleeting days. Christmas in the medieval imagination was both sacred and sensorial. The Nativity, retold in churches and homes, was more than a story. It was a living ritual. Tables groaned under the weight of pies, roasted meats, and sweet preserves. In wealthy households, the display could rival the church altars themselves. Gilded dishes, sugar sculptures shaped like animals or saints, and golden baked pastries that shimmered in candlelight. Goose and capon, sometimes fattened for months, were centerpiece, their skins crisp to perfection over open hearths. For the nobility, this feast was a demonstration of wealth and piety, a performative devotion through gastronomy. Peasant homes, though humble, echoed the same seasonal intent. Cabbage, root vegetables, salted meats, and small pies formed the core of the celebration. Ale and mead were poured generously. Families gathered close to the hearth, where children listened to tales of saints, kings, and miraculous births. Even the simplest meal carried ritual significance. A shared pie might be cut into symbols of blessing, a small fig or nut hidden inside as a token of fortune for the finder. In frost-bound regions, the very act of gathering indoors, of sharing warmth and food, was a miracle itself. The contrast between wealth and poverty was stark, yet the essence of celebration transcended status. At all levels, food was a bridge between mortal toil and sacred joy. Recipes were adapted to availability. Spices were substituted, meats preserved longer, honeyed sweets rationed carefully. What mattered was not luxury, but abundance relative to scarcity. A pie with a crust too thick, or a roasted bird too dry, still became a centerpiece of memory, a focal point of communal joy amid a world hardened by frost. Carnival, arriving after the darkest weeks, carried a different, almost riotous spirit. While Christmas honored divinity and family, Carnival celebrated reversal, indulgence, and communal release. In towns across Europe, masks, costumes, and music filled the streets. Market stalls overflowed with pies, cakes, and preserved meats, each dish an invitation to delight in excess before the austerity of Lent. Sugar, imported and costly, was sprinkled liberally. Marzipan figures, shaped into animals or devils, amused and provoked. Spiced sausages and hearty stews fueled laughter, song, and dance. Winter's chill could not dampen this fire of indulgence. Food during Carnival was as much about symbolism as sustenance. Pies filled with hidden objects, coins, beans, or tiny figurines, determined fortune. Mock kings were crowned with cakes, and drinks flowed as freely as mirth. Ale, mead, and mulled wine were central, raising spirits and loosening tongues. The medieval chronicler might note drunken revels or overturned tables, but beneath the chaos lay a societal rhythm. The world turned upside down, tensions released, and communities emerged from winter with renewed cohesion. Across both festivals, preservation was key. Winter demanded ingenuity. Fruits were dried or candied, meats salted or smoked, pies filled with seasonal root vegetables, herbs, and available game. Recipes recorded in manuscripts reveal meticulous detail. Spices measured to a pinch, dough kneaded to consistency, roasting times calculated to ensure perfection, even over variable hearth flames. Every dish carried the dual purpose of delight and survival, a delicate balance of indulgence and pragmatism. Spices played a central role in these feasts, their presence a marker of status and sophistication. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger transformed humble dough into exotic pleasure. In the homes of nobles, sugar and saffron were used to colour and flavour pies, reflecting light off pastry surfaces like gilded snow. Even in more modest households, a sprinkle of local herbs or a dash of honey could elevate a simple dish, transforming it into something magical for the eyes and the palate. These flavours were more than taste. They were conduits of imagination, memory, and desire. Christmas and Carnival were also deeply social events, extending beyond the household. In towns, guilds, churches, and communal halls coordinated feasts that brought entire villages together. Long tables, benches scraped smooth by generations, became stages for performance and ritual. Songs were sung, dances performed, and stories recited, all accompanied by shared dishes. A single pie might be carved and distributed, each portion a small act of inclusion. Ale and wine flowed, uniting classes, if only briefly, in shared celebration and warmth. The rituals were interwoven with the season's natural cycles. Winter was not merely a backdrop, it shaped the very form of these feasts. Frost dictated what could be stored, snow altered transportation of goods, frozen rivers determined access to markets. Recipes adapted accordingly. Hearty stews that could simmer slowly, preserved fruits and nuts to last the season. Pies that could be eaten cold or reheated over embers. Even the timing of festivals corresponded to celestial events, with the winter solstice influencing the placement of feasts and the length of fasting periods. Food and time, human and natural rhythms, intertwined seamlessly. Yet not all was cheerful. Chroniclers occasionally note famines or harsh winters that reduced these festivals to shadowed echoes of their intended grandeur. The same snow that preserved meats could trap villagers from markets, and a poor harvest could limit spices to near invisibility. In such years, a single fig or slice of honeyed cake became a treasure, a testament to resilience and the human capacity to find joy amid hardship. Even in scarcity, rituals persisted, proving that the heart of celebration was as much about intention as abundance. The medieval imagination saw these festivals as moral and cosmic lessons. Christmas emphasized charity, humility, and reverence. Carnival highlighted freedom, indulgence, and reflection on human folly. Food was the language through which these lessons were spoken. Pies that concealed surprises, meats roasted to perfection, sweets that dazzled the eye, and drinks that encouraged both reflection and revelry. The table became a theatre, the act of eating a performance, the season itself a narrative of contrast between light and dark, indulgence and austerity, community and solitude. Consider, for a moment, the visual tableau. Candlelight flickers against frosted windows. The scent of roasted goose mingles with spiced wine. Laughter echoes off timber walls. Children peek at marzipan devils. Elders exchange knowing smiles. And strangers are welcomed with a slice of pie or a draught of ale. Outside, winter rages, but inside, warmth, taste, and ritual create a small kingdom of human endurance. Food is not merely sustenance, it is story, memory, and connection, a bridge over the long, dark months. As you imagine these feasts, note the attention to detail. Recipes were recorded, spices catalogued, serving vessels treasured. Even in manuscripts, illustrations depict lavish tables, pies cut to reveal hidden charms, roasted birds arranged with artistic flourish. These records were both practical guides and symbols of aspiration, showing what could be achieved when human ingenuity met seasonal challenge. Each dish was a triumph over frost, each meal a defiance of winter's dominion. Ultimately, the festivals of ice remind us that human beings have always sought warmth and light in the darkest times. Christmas and carnival tables were more than nourishment. They were celebrations of life itself. Through pies, roasted meats, preserved fruits, spiced wines, and the communal joy of shared feasting, medieval people created moments of transcendence amid hardship. They transformed frost, darkness, and scarcity into joy, memory, and ritual. So when you sip spiced wine or carve a festive pie, remember the medieval halls where these traditions were born. Imagine candlelight flickering on timber walls, laughter rising above the hiss of the hearth, the careful artistry of cooks and bakers shaping winter into warmth. Across centuries, the same desires persist: to gather, to celebrate, to find delight in abundance, and to carve joy from the cold. In those moments, frost itself becomes a partner in human imagination, framing celebration, shaping ritual, and reminding us that even in winter, life finds a way to feast. Chapter 9: Strange and Forgotten Recipes. You won't believe. Imagine opening a medieval cookbook, its pages yellowed with age, the ink blurred by centuries of handling, and encountering a recipe so bizarre that it makes modern palates recoil. Medieval kitchens were laboratories of curiosity, survival, and audacity, where cooks dared combinations that would seem outrageous today. These were not mere meals. They were statements of ingenuity, necessity, or at times, pure spectacle. In the frozen months, when ingredients were scarce and imagination abundant, strange and forgotten recipes emerged as both sustenance and entertainment. One of the most bewildering examples comes from the kitchens of English nobility, the cockentrice. It was a grotesque hybrid of two animals, a suckling pig and a capon, stitched together, roasted, and presented as a single monstrous creature. Its eyes often studded with cloves, wings arranged theatrically. The cockentrice was less about nourishment than about awe. Guests would recoil, laugh, and marvel at the ingenuity. It was a feast for the eyes, a conversation starter, a reminder that winter banquets were arenas where imagination could rival even the harshest frost. In addition to hybrid meats, medieval cooks experimented with preservation in unusual ways. Garlic and almond pudding, a concoction of crushed almonds, garlic, breadcrumbs, and sweet spices, might seem absurd today, yet in its time, it reflected a balance of flavors that medieval palates prized: pungency, sweetness, and richness intertwined. The dish could be served hot or cold, as a main or a dessert, depending on the household and the occasion. Here, we glimpse a culinary philosophy that placed daring over convention, proving that taste was as much about creativity as ingredients. The fascination with odd pairings extended to seafood. Lamprey pies were highly prized in England and France, often prepared with wine, saffron, and sweet spices. Lampreys, eel-like and unsettling in appearance, were considered a delicacy fit for kings. Their preparation required careful handling, long hours of cleaning, and a deft touch with seasoning. Eating one was an experience of contrast: the chewy flesh, the aroma of herbs, the sweetness of wine. It was a ritual as much as a meal, demonstrating status, skill, and a willingness to embrace the unfamiliar. Not all strange recipes were designed for the upper classes. Peasant communities, too, displayed surprising inventiveness. In areas where fresh meat was scarce, dishes like black pudding with fruits or root vegetable stews, thickened with grains, emerged. The combination of savory and sweet, meat and fruit, was practical yet experimental. Peasants transformed what little they had into dishes that could sustain energy, please the palate, and even entertain the imagination. These meals were humble, yet they shared the same adventurous spirit as noble feasts. Some recipes verged on the theatrical. Consider swan or peacock pies, often served whole, birds arranged in lifelike poses, sometimes with wings and heads intact. In certain recipes, the bird's plumage was dyed with saffron, paprika, or beet juice to dazzle diners. These pies were spectacles, blurring the line between meal and performance art. Winter, with its long nights and gatherings, provided the perfect canvas. The hearth cast shadows on gilded crusts, candlelight flickered across feathered forms, and the room collectively held its breath before the knife revealed the spectacle within. Herbs and spices were often employed in surprising ways. Rosewater and verdure sauces accompanied meats like venison or pork, blending tartness, sweetness, and floral notes. While modern diners might balk at drinking a sauce infused with flower petals, medieval cooks understood that flavor could transcend familiarity. Spices were both luxury and experimentation. Imported cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were used to elevate even the most humble ingredients. In some cases, a single pinch could transform a dish from ordinary to extraordinary, making a winter meal a statement of creativity and wealth. Even desserts ventured into the bizarre. Marzipan animals, shaped with meticulous detail, were sometimes baked into pies or used to crown cakes. Almonds were crushed, molded, and dyed with natural colors to create figures of birds, beasts, and mythological creatures. Eating these creations was as much about theater as taste. The diner admired the artistry, then savored the sweetness. Other desserts combined unusual textures, breadcrumbs, honey, cheese, or even meats, challenging the line between sweet and savory. Here again, winter provided a natural laboratory. Preservation allowed ingredients to be experimented with over months, and the extended darkness offered the time to perfect these intricate preparations. One of the most curious phenomena of medieval winter cooking was the use of mock meats. Dishes like almond sausages or vegetable-based hams were substitutes during fasting periods, particularly Advent or Lent. Yet these substitutes were anything but simple. Almonds, breadcrumbs, eggs, and spices were shaped, roasted, and glazed to mimic the appearance, texture, and even the taste of meat. Such dishes reveal a culture both deeply religious and delightfully inventive, where fasting was a moral obligation, but creativity ensured the palate was never neglected. Perhaps strangest of all were recipes designed to shock or amuse. Swan with orange and sugar glaze was a dish that combined a majestic bird with the sweetness of sugar and the tang of citrus, ingredients that were exotic, costly, and symbolically powerful. The medieval mind saw food as theatre. The unusual combination invited conversation, laughter, and even moral reflection. Eating was never merely about sustenance. It was about engagement, performance, and the human desire to astonish one another, even in the depths of winter. In manuscripts, the instructions for these recipes often read like spells. Measures were imprecise by modern standards. A handful of herbs, enough sugar, or a goodly portion of meat. Timing relied on experience. Roasting over embers, boiling until tender, baking until golden. The cook had to interpret, improvise, and adapt. Such ambiguity created room for creativity, resulting in dishes that varied widely across households, seasons, and regions. No two cocentreaces or lamprey pies were exactly alike. Each reflected the skill, imagination, and resourcefulness of the cook. Food in this context was deeply symbolic. Strange recipes often carried moral, social, or political meaning. Hybrid animals suggested dominion over nature. Mock meats reflected piety and ingenuity, and elaborate pies and pastries demonstrated wealth, hospitality, and theatricality. Sharing these dishes reinforced social hierarchies, entertained guests, and transformed winter nights into occasions of wonder. They remind us that the medieval imagination saw no boundary between art, ritual, and sustenance. The forgotten recipes that survive in manuscripts today tell stories as vivid as any chronicle, as any. Pies stuffed with birds within birds, almond jellies flavored with exotic spices, meat sauces infused with rosewater. Each is a window into a world where creativity, scarcity, and ambition collided. They challenge our assumptions about medieval cuisine, revealing it as adventurous, sophisticated, and at times delightfully audacious. Winter, with its scarcity and extended darkness, was not a limitation, but a canvas for culinary exploration. Even the simplest forgotten recipes reveal cultural priorities. Root vegetables preserved with honey, grains combined with dried fruits, and herbs steeped in sauces highlight resourcefulness and a desire for flavor, even when resources were limited. In peasant kitchens, creativity was practical, turning necessity into delight. In noble kitchens, the same impulse became theatrical, turning food into spectacle. Across classes, these strange recipes reveal a shared human instinct to experiment, to astonish, and to find joy even in the bleakest months. The legacy of these recipes is still felt today. Modern chefs, inspired by historical manuscripts, attempt to recreate lamprey pies or marzipan animals, discovering the audacity and imagination of medieval cooks. While some dishes challenge contemporary tastes, they also reveal a culture deeply engaged with food as art, ritual, and survival. The frozen winters of Europe were not merely obstacles. They were incubators of culinary invention, producing recipes that shock, delight, and endure in memory. As we reflect on these strange and forgotten dishes, consider the courage required to create them. Imagine a cook in a frostbound kitchen, experimenting with cloves, saffron, and almonds, or sewing together a pig and a capon, aware that the eyes of the noble court will judge their creation. Picture children and guests staring wide-eyed, laughter and murmurs rising above the crackle of the hearth. In that moment, winter becomes a collaborator, scarcity becomes a muse, and food transcends sustenance, becoming performance, memory, and art. These recipes, once ordinary to their creators, now astonish us across centuries. They remind us that human creativity is boundless, that taste is subjective and fluid, and that even in harshest seasons, imagination flourishes. Forgotten dishes, hybrid meats, spiced desserts, and theatrical pies are not just curiosities. They are echoes of a mindset that embraced audacity, sought joy, and transformed frost and scarcity into wonder. So, as we turn the pages of medieval cookbooks, let us not merely marvel at the oddity of these recipes. Let us see the world through their eyes. A world where winter nights are long, fires are warm, tables are laden with wonder, and human ingenuity turns the most unlikely ingredients into stories, memories, and feasts that endure. The frozen kitchens of the past, with all their strange and forgotten recipes, invite us to celebrate creativity, resilience, and the timeless human desire to astonish, delight, and gather around food, even when the frost bites hardest. Chapter 10: Preserving the Feast. Techniques to survive the winter. The first frost of winter was more than a herald of cold. It was a silent threat to life itself. Medieval families understood this instinctively. As the sun sank lower and the fields lay bare, kitchens transformed from places of daily preparation into strategic command centers. Preserving food was not a matter of convenience. It was a matter of survival. Every technique, from salting to smoking, carried both the wisdom of generations and the anxiety of necessity. Imagine a medieval kitchen at dusk. Smoke curls from the hearth, mingling with the scent of roasting meats and simmering stews. Families and servants work together, each movement precise, honed by routine and instinct. Large wooden tables are covered with freshly harvested vegetables, racks of meat, and baskets of fruit. The hum of activity is punctuated by the crackle of firewood and the occasional bark of a dog, sensing that the household is preparing for the months ahead. Winter is approaching, and nothing can be left to chance. Salting was perhaps the most widespread preservation method. Layers of coarse salt could transform meat into a durable source of protein that would last months. Hams, beef, and fish were rubbed, packed, and stored in barrels or clay jars. The salt drew moisture from the flesh, creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria. Yet salting was an art as much as a science. Too little, and decay would set in. Too much, and the meat would become inedible. Cooks learned through trial and error, adjusting amounts, layering techniques, and even rotating barrels to ensure even curing. Smoking was another cornerstone. Over smouldering oak, beech, or fruit wood, meats and fish slowly absorbed aromatic smoke. This process not only preserved, but also imbued dishes with flavors that would later be celebrated in winter feasts. Imagine the scent drifting through a snow-laden village, promising sustenance and warmth. For the medieval household, smoke was both guardian and storyteller. It carried the memory of summer forests and autumn harvests into the bleak midwinter. Drying was equally vital. Fruits, herbs, and vegetables were hung from rafters or threaded on strings, left to dehydrate in cold, dry air. Apples, pears, and plums shriveled into dense, sweet morsels. Herbs retained their fragrance, ready to flavor winter stews. Grains, too, were stored in sacks or clay bins, protected from moisture and pests. Every preserved item represented careful planning, the foresight of harvests, and the labor of many hands. In medieval society, the success of winter often depended not on wealth alone, but on the meticulous application of these preservation techniques. Sugar and honey were rare but invaluable allies. When available, they could preserve fruits in syrups or candied forms. Apples and quinces were boiled in honey, then stored in jars, providing both a sweet treat and a concentrated source of energy. Even the smallest amounts of sugar could extend the life of perishables, transforming seasonal bounty into sustenance that bridged months of scarcity. The kitchen thus became a laboratory, blending practicality with ingenuity, each jar and sack a promise against hunger. Pickling was equally widespread. Vinegar, salt, and fermented liquids created acidic environments hostile to spoilage. Vegetables, fish, and even meats were submerged in brine or vinegar solutions, allowing flavors to develop while keeping the food edible. Pickled cucumbers, cabbage, and herring were common, yet each recipe varied from region to region. The art of pickling required observation. Noting the texture, smell, and color of the preserved food was essential, for one misstep could result in disaster. Dairy, delicate and perishable, required special attention. Butter was churned and stored in cool cellars or immersed in brine. Cheese was pressed, salted, and aged to extend its shelf life. Monasteries often excelled in these techniques, creating hard cheeses that could last through the harshest winters. In the process, they preserved not only nourishment but cultural heritage, passing down recipes and methods that bridge centuries. Even more remarkable were the methods developed for fish. In coastal and riverine regions, communities relied on smoked, salted, and dried fish to survive months without fresh catches. Cod, herring, and eel were carefully processed and layered in barrels or hung in smokehouses. The winter diet of these communities was shaped by these preservation techniques, a testament to both ingenuity and necessity. Every bite was a connection to the labor of months past, to the fishers and cooks who ensured survival against the merciless cold. Root cellars and storage pits were architectural solutions to preservation. Buried beneath layers of earth, these cool, dark spaces protected vegetables, fruits, and even barrels of meat from frost and spoilage. The design of these cellars was precise. Ventilation, insulation, and drainage all mattered. They were silent witnesses to medieval ingenuity, allowing households to bridge the gap between harvest and spring planting. In these subterranean chambers, potatoes, carrots, turnips, and cabbages endured, awaiting the warmth of cooking fires to transform them into nourishing stews. Winter also demanded careful planning in menus. Preservation dictated what could be eaten and when. Early winter saw the freshest produce consumed, while midwinter relied on stored meats, salted fish, and dried fruits. Feasts became carefully orchestrated events, combining preserved ingredients into dishes that were both flavorful and practical. Pies, stews, and porridges incorporated whatever was available. Each meal a testament to strategy, skill, and the human drive to create joy amid scarcity. Alcohol, too, played a role in preservation. Ale, mead, and wine were not only beverages, but preservatives for certain foods. Fruits could be submerged in wine, meats marinated in beer, and sauces enriched with spirits. These techniques extended shelf life, enhanced flavor, and provided warmth in a season defined by cold. The medieval cook, aware of the interplay between chemistry and taste, wielded alcohol as both tool and ingredient. The techniques of preservation were learned from necessity, but refined into art. Nobility employed skilled kitchen staff to ensure that every ingredient lasted and that feasts maintained their grandeur throughout winter. In peasant households, knowledge was passed down orally, often with variations suited to local conditions. Both extremes of society depended on the same principles: anticipate scarcity, transform raw materials, and embrace ingenuity. Each preserved item carried the imprint of human skill and foresight. By studying these methods, we glimpse the profound connection between humans and their environment. Winter was not merely a season. It was a challenge, a teacher, and an architect of culture. Preservation techniques reveal resilience, creativity, and adaptability, showing that medieval societies did not passively endure the cold. They mastered it. The ingenuity embedded in these methods continues to inspire modern culinary and preservation practices, reminding us that necessity often births innovation. As we reflect on these practices, consider the hands that work tirelessly in dim kitchens, the fires stoked for hours, the careful layering of salt and smoke. Each preserved item, barrel of salted herring, smoked ham, jar of honeyed fruit, was a promise against hunger, a labor of love, and a testament to human endurance. Medieval winter kitchens were theaters of survival, where science, art, and instinct intertwined to sustain life in the harshest months. Preservation was, in essence, the heartbeat of winter. It allowed communities to thrive despite scarcity, to celebrate feasts despite frost, and to connect with the cycles of the natural world. Without it, the long nights would have been merciless. With it, humans turned cold, dark months into periods of creativity, ritual, and nourishment. So, when we bite into a piece of smoked meat, savor a jar of pickled vegetables, or admire the sweetness of preserved fruits, we are touching a legacy that stretches back centuries. Medieval cooks, confronted by frost and famine, transformed survival into art and necessity into imagination. Their techniques are echoes of a time when every meal was a calculated triumph, every preserved ingredient a testament to foresight, and every winter feast a celebration of human resilience. In the frozen shadows of history, the kitchens that mastered preservation whisper to us across time. They invite us to marvel at ingenuity, to respect labor, and to appreciate the subtle beauty hidden in the mundane. The barrel of salted fish, the smokehouse's aroma, the cool root cellar. Winter demanded mastery, and those who mastered it fed not only their bodies, but their communities, their culture, and ultimately, their legacy. Chapter 11. When Famine Came. The Taste of Desperation. The chill of winter could be cruel, but famine was a far more sinister spectre. It crept slowly at first, barely noticeable. A poor harvest here, a spoiled grain sack there. Then, almost imperceptibly, it settled like a grey shroud over villages and towns. Bread became scarce, meat a luxury, and the warmth of the hearth could no longer chase away the gnawing hunger. In medieval Europe, famine was not merely an inconvenience. It was a relentless adversary that tested the limits of human endurance, ingenuity, and morality. Picture a village in late November, fields stripped bare, snow beginning to crust the earth. Children huddle by feeble fires, their breaths visible in the cold air, eyes hollow yet watchful. Mothers and fathers move silently, rationing what little remains. Every grain, Every vegetable, every piece of meat becomes precious. The very act of eating transforms from sustenance to survival, from pleasure to necessity. Hunger dictates life. It reshapes society, forcing choices that echo with both despair and resilience. Famine often struck after a series of misfortunes. A failed harvest, unusually harsh winters, floods, or infestations could devastate crops. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, followed excessive rains that destroyed cereal crops across Europe. Fields that once promised abundance turned to mud, and grain stores dwindled rapidly. Villages that had survived prior winters suddenly faced empty larders, and the normal rhythm of life, baking bread, preserving meat, brewing ale, was thrown into chaos. The human response to famine was as diverse as it was desperate. Households relied on stored grains, root vegetables, and any preserved food remaining from the previous season. But when those reserves ran out, creativity became a matter of life and death. People turned to wild herbs, foraged plants, and unconventional sources of protein, acorns, bark, and even rodents. Recipes that might have seemed strange in times of plenty became lifelines. The taste of desperation was bitter, earthy, and raw, a reflection of survival stripped to its barest form. One record from 14th century England tells of families grinding fallen acorns into coarse flour, mixing it with water to create a dark, gritty porridge. Villagers scavenged the edges of forests for nuts and roots, risking exposure to wolves and frostbitten fields. Fish from frozen rivers were gathered, smoked quickly, or eaten raw when firewood was scarce. The medieval palate was forced to expand in ways unimaginable today. The act of eating became an exercise in courage as much as in necessity. Hunger transformed social structures. Wealthier households sometimes hoarded what little remained, while poorer neighbors faced stark choices. Theft, bartering, and even begging increased as desperation deepened. Communities fractured under the strain, but they also occasionally coalesced, sharing scarce food to ensure collective survival. Records describe communal bread ovens where every household contributed scraps to create a single loaf. It was not merely sustenance, it was solidarity against the unforgiving winter. In towns, markets became arenas of anxiety and tension. Prices for staple foods soared as scarcity intensified. Grain merchants faced impossible dilemmas: sell to the highest bidder and profit, or distribute fairly and risk ruin. Bread riots were not uncommon, erupting in a fury of fear, hunger, and frustration. The medieval urban landscape became a place of palpable tension, where the scent of empty markets mixed with the smoke of kitchen fires, and the shadow of famine hovered over every alley. Even the nobility, shielded from immediate deprivation, could not escape famine's reach entirely. Estates dependent on tenant farmers faced diminished yields, forcing lords to adjust rations, postpone feasts, or reallocate stored grains. Kitchens that once overflowed with pies, meats, and spiced delicacies now struggled to provide simple, filling meals. The contrast between the abundance of memory and the stark reality of famine underscored the fragility of medieval sustenance. The psychological impact of famine was profound. Chronic hunger dulls the body, but it sharpens the mind in unexpected ways. Communities developed rituals, prayers, and offerings in hopes of divine intervention. Monasteries became refuges, offering bread, pottage, and ale to the desperate. Clergy recorded the horrors of famine with meticulous care, not merely as chronicles of mortality, but as testimonies to human endurance. Hunger shaped the medieval imagination, embedding itself in literature, art, and folklore. Stories of starvation, miraculous survival, and moral lessons were passed down, influencing generations long after the last grain had been eaten. Desperation also sparked innovation. When wheat failed, people experimented with barley, rye, or oats. Unconventional recipes emerged from necessity. Soups thickened with ground nuts, puddings made from meager flour, and stews incorporating wild plants. Every ingredient was scrutinized, every method tested. The medieval cook became a scientist in miniature, experimenting, observing, and documenting, often under the pressure of life and death. The taste of these creations was rough, unfamiliar, yet it kept bodies alive through relentless winters. Accounts from famine-stricken regions reveal stark realities. In Ireland during the Great Famine centuries later, people survived on seaweed, nettles, and the occasional rodent. While distant in time, these stories echo the medieval experience. The tension between survival and morality, the shift from abundance to scarcity, and the indomitable will to endure. Food was no longer merely sustenance. It was identity, status, and the measure of human resilience. Famine exposed the delicate balance between nature and society. The loss of a single harvest could cascade into months of suffering. Villagers learned to read the sky, observe the soil, and plan for contingencies. Kitchen gardens became strategic assets. Wild plants were catalogued for survival, and preservation techniques were refined to their limits. Famine, while devastating, forged a profound understanding of the environment, embedding knowledge that would inform future generations. Yet, famine was not merely external. It revealed internal conflicts too. Families faced ethical dilemmas. Who would eat first? What could be spared? And what was too precious to sacrifice? Stories of extreme measures, cooking leather, eating the unthinkable, or rationing children, are chilling reminders of the human cost. Yet within these narratives, there is also testimony to compassion, resourcefulness, and the stubbornness of life. Hunger did not erase humanity, it distilled it. Even in desperation, medieval people sought comfort and ritual. Meals, when possible, were shared with care, accompanied by prayers or blessings. A bowl of thin gruel could become a sacred moment, a reminder of community and hope. Famine sharpened the senses. Taste, smell, and touch became acute. Memory of past abundance haunting every morsel. The kitchen, hearth, and table were transformed into arenas of survival, negotiation, and moral reflection. By studying these dark seasons, we understand not only the fragility of medieval life, but also the ingenuity and courage that sustained it. Hunger forced humans to confront mortality and morality simultaneously. Every survival strategy, every unconventional recipe, every risk taken to find sustenance reveals a society negotiating with the limits of nature and circumstance. Famine was a teacher, albeit a cruel one, instructing patience, resilience, and the value of foresight. The taste of desperation lingered long after the winter passed. Families remembered the rough textures, the bitter flavors, and the smell of smoke and herbs used to mask the scarcity of ingredients. Songs, chronicles, and oral stories immortalize these moments, turning individual suffering into collective memory. Famine shaped culture, literature, and human behavior in ways that abundance never could. It was a harsh, unforgiving sculptor, carving resilience and ingenuity into the bones of society. When we reflect on these episodes today, there is both horror and awe. Horror at the physical and emotional toll exacted by scarcity, and awe at the ingenuity and determination it inspired. The medieval experience of famine reminds us that human survival is rarely simple, that food is never merely nourishment, and that every meal carries a history of struggle, adaptation, and courage. So, as we consider the taste of desperation, we confront a duality: the fragility of life against the resilience of the human spirit. Medieval kitchens, fields, and forests were more than sites of sustenance. They were theaters of survival, laboratories of adaptation, and archives of memory. Hunger was a harsh tutor, but through it, humanity learned to endure, innovate, and ultimately, hope. In the shadows of famine, the stories of survival remain etched in the culinary history of the medieval world. They teach us to honor both the food on our plates and the labor, foresight, and courage that allowed ancestors to endure seasons of scarcity. Each preserved morsel, each unconventional meal, each shared bowl of gruel carries the echo of lives lived at the edge of survival. Reminders that even in desperation, human ingenuity and solidarity endure. Chapter 12. Echoes in Modern Winter Recipes. Step into any modern kitchen during winter, and you might think you are worlds apart from the frostbitten feasts of the medieval era. Yet, beneath the gleaming counters, stainless steel appliances, and aroma of spiced lattes, echoes of centuries-old winter recipes persist. Each bite of roasted chestnuts, mulled cider, or gingerbread carries whispers of survival, ingenuity, and celebration that once defined a harsher, colder world. The past, it seems, is never truly gone. It lingers on our tables, in our utensils, and in the warmth of shared meals. Imagine the streets of a contemporary city in December. Snow glistens on rooftops, holiday lights flicker, and families bustle through markets laden with seasonal produce. The scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves drifts through the air, drawing people toward bakeries and cafes. These sensory experiences are comforting, yet they are also echoes, traces of practices born in times when winter demanded creativity, endurance, and careful planning. What we now consider festive indulgences were once critical for survival, designed to preserve nutrients, extend the shelf life of food, or bring joy during bleak months. Take gingerbread, for instance. Today, it is a symbol of festive cheer, shaped into cookies, houses, and intricate decorations. But in medieval Europe, gingerbread was a marvel of preservation and flavor. Honey, a natural antiseptic, and spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves help prevent spoilage while imbuing dense breads with warmth and depth. Monasteries and urban bakers perfected these recipes, combining limited ingredients into creations that could endure the winter months. Modern bakers continue this tradition, layering spices and sweetness not merely for taste, but as a continuation of centuries of culinary ingenuity. Mulled drinks are another thread connecting past and present. In contemporary kitchens, a pot of mulled wine or cider simmers gently, releasing fragrant steam. This ritual, steeped in comfort, mirrors medieval practices where heated spiced wine or ale was more than a drink. It was a vehicle for warmth, cheer, and sometimes even medicinal purposes. Cloves, nutmeg, and citrus were prized not only for their taste, but for their rarity and preservative qualities. Today, when we stir our mugs and inhale the spiced aroma, we partake in a tradition that once united families and communities around fires, shielding them from the biting cold. Even modern roasted vegetables and root dishes owe much to their medieval predecessors. Carrots, parsnips, turnips, and cabbages, often overlooked in summer months, became staples of winter feasts. Techniques such as slow roasting, braising, or glazing were developed to enhance flavor while extending shelf life. Today, chefs play with these vegetables in ways our ancestors could scarcely imagine, adding butter, honey, or exotic spices. But the essence remains. Winter demands resilience, patience, and creativity in the kitchen. The preservation of fruit is another remarkable connection. Dried fruits, jams, and preserved citrus were essential in medieval winter kitchens. They provided calories, vitamins, and bursts of sweetness when fresh produce was scarce. Modern bakers and cooks continue to honor these practices, crafting fruitcakes, tarts, and preserves that pay homage to a time when preserving the harvest was not merely tradition, but survival. The subtle sweetness of a prune tart or the tartness of preserved cherries resonates with centuries of human effort to defy the limitations of winter. Modern winter desserts, from rich custards to spiced puddings, often trace their lineage to medieval recipes designed to maximize flavor with minimal resources. Egg custards, rice puddings, and boiled desserts were once carefully calculated to make use of limited ingredients. Spices were measured and rationed, and cooking methods were adapted to hearths and open flames. Today, these desserts might seem luxurious, but every bite is an echo of a world where ingenuity and careful planning could mean the difference between nourishment and hunger. The influence of medieval winter recipes extends even to beverages like hot chocolate, which would have been inconceivable centuries ago, but shares a conceptual link: the desire to create warmth, comfort, and sustenance during the coldest months. Modern recipes combine historical techniques, stewing, infusing, and spicing, with ingredients that were once exotic or unattainable, creating a bridge between eras. Each sip reminds us that winter, though more forgiving today, still inspires culinary creativity. In contemporary celebrations, communal meals continue to echo medieval practices. Christmas feasts, Hanukkah dinners, and New Year's celebrations often emphasize sharing and abundance, reflecting a long history of food as a binding force. Medieval communities relied on collective effort to survive harsh winters, pooling resources, sharing knowledge, and celebrating the rare moments of plenty. The same spirit endures today. Holiday meals bring people together, fostering connection, gratitude, and the comforting rhythm of tradition. Modern chefs also draw inspiration from medieval flavor combinations that might seem unusual by today's standards. Savory pies with fruits, meats spiced with cinnamon and clove, and hearty stews with unexpected herbs all echo centuries-old experiments. These dishes remind us that the boundaries of taste are flexible and historically contingent, shaped by necessity, availability, and cultural exchange. The modern kitchen is, in a sense, a laboratory where echoes of medieval experimentation still resonate. Even the act of preserving herbs and vegetables in winter is a modern continuation of medieval practice. Pickling, fermenting, and curing were essential to survive long months without fresh produce. Today, artisanal pickles, fermented vegetables, and homemade preserves celebrate both flavor and history. Each jar is a small monument to human perseverance, a tangible link to ancestors who labored to keep winter from claiming their stores. In households around the world, the modern winter table is a living archive. Cinnamon buns, roasted root vegetables, mulled cider, and spiced cookies may appear simple, but they carry centuries of innovation, adaptation, and survival. They remind us that every winter recipe is a story, a narrative of human creativity facing the immutable challenge of cold and scarcity. The very act of cooking in winter is a dialogue with the past, a conversation in which ingredients, techniques, and flavors are the words and sentences of history. Even contemporary holiday rituals, like decorating gingerbread houses or baking fruitcakes, are shaped by echoes of survival. In medieval times, the act of baking was not only culinary, but symbolic. It affirmed life, community, and hope. Today, the gestures may be playful or decorative, yet they retain the essence of their origins, transforming flour, sugar, and spice into symbols of endurance and joy. Every tradition, no matter how whimsical, carries the weight of historical memory. The global nature of modern winter cuisine also mirrors medieval trade and exchange. Exotic spices, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Moluccas, sugar from distant plantations, once traveled hundreds of miles to reach European kitchens. These ingredients shaped flavor, status, and preservation. Today, they are ubiquitous, yet their inclusion in winter recipes connects us to a past defined by trade, risk, and the desire to transcend seasonal limitations. Every sprinkle of spice is an echo of perilous voyages and the mingling of cultures. By examining the echoes of medieval winter recipes in modern kitchens, we also understand how human priorities have shifted. What was once survival has become pleasure. Necessity has become artistry. Yet, the underlying principles endure: resourcefulness, seasonality, flavor, and shared experience. Modern winter meals are richer, sweeter, and more varied than their ancestors, but they are built upon centuries of accumulated knowledge, experimentation, and adaptation. In the end, every modern winter recipe is a bridge, linking us to ancestors who faced the relentless cold with ingenuity and courage. As we slice into a spiced cake, pour a steaming cup of mulled cider, or roast vegetables to golden perfection, we participate in a lineage of human resilience. The past is never distant. It lingers in our kitchens, wafts through the steam of cooking pots, and settles in the warmth of shared tables. Every meal is an invitation to remember, honor, and continue the story. So as we savor the comfort of modern winter recipes, let us recognize them not merely as food, but as vessels of history. They remind us that human creativity, endurance, and the simple need to nourish one another transcend centuries. In the laughter around the holiday table, in the aroma of freshly baked bread, and in the warmth of shared meals, the frostbitten kitchens of the past live on, whispering their stories in every bite. Winter, though softened by modern convenience, still invites reflection, care, and creativity. Through our kitchens and recipes, we maintain a dialogue with the past, transforming scarcity into abundance, hardship into delight, and tradition into inspiration. Modern winter cuisine is, in essence, a celebration of human endurance, continuity, and the timeless art of turning cold, barren months into moments of warmth, flavor, and shared joy. Conclusion and reflections. As our journey through frostbitten kitchens and medieval winter tables draws to a close, we pause to reflect on what these ancient recipes reveal. Not just about food, but about human resilience, creativity, and the enduring warmth of shared meals. From the frost-chilled streets of medieval Europe to the bustling kitchens of our modern world, every spiced loaf, mulled drink, and preserved fruit carries a story, an echo of lives lived in the shadow of winter's harsh embrace. We hope this exploration has transported you through centuries, letting you feel the bite of the cold, the flicker of candlelight, and the fragrant, spice-laden air of medieval feasts. As you sit by your own table, perhaps with a warm drink in hand, remember that every recipe you enjoy has a lineage, a bridge connecting your moment of comfort with countless generations who cooked, celebrated, and survived in the frost. If you found this journey into history as mesmerizing as we intended, please support the channel with a like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what city, country, or time period you're watching from. It's a small gesture, but it brings us together across oceans and eras, reminding us that history and human curiosity has no boundaries. Thank you for taking the time to wander through centuries of winter kitchens with us. Your presence here, your interest in the past, keeps the stories alive. Until our next historical exploration, may your evenings be warm, your meals flavorful, and your imagination unbound. Good night, and may the echoes of history linger in your hearts and kitchens long after the fire has dimmed.